As heresy took hold in Europe, its social implications deepened. The Church had to contend with challenges both to religious and civic worlds. Medieval Europe knew no meaningful separation of church and state. This meant challenges and conflicts in one sphere had immediate implications for the other. In what is today's southern France, a powerful social and religious movement gained strength. Its adherents were called Cathars. The heresy spread through all levels of society in that region, from the peasantry to the higher nobility. In the course of the 12th century, the matter became endemic to the social fabric of Languedoc. An analysis of the Cathar faith reveals some justification for considering it not a Christian aberration at all, but a separate religion. Churchmen were duly concerned. Anxiety spread all the way to the papal court. Eventually, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the recalcitrant Cathars. That engagement, known as the Albigensian Crusades, lasted 20 years. The outcomes were profound. This is the story of the Cathar heretics in Languedoc.
On the morning of December the 2nd, 1299, the residents of the southern French town of Albi awoke to the news that 25 of her leading citizens had been arrested, charged with heresy, and had already disappeared into the bishop's dungeons. This region of southern France that I want to focus on in this particular lecture was described by investigating authorities in the 13th and 14th centuries as a place where heretics rave madly. Now, many of the popular movements for church reform and renewal, within particularly the later Middle Ages, began as reactions to the medieval church in the way in which it had developed and the way in which it had come to be in the 13th century. Even as orthodox a churchman as Bernard of Clairvaux, whom we've mentioned many times, had a similar critique of the church. Now, the critique that he wrote was against Cluny, but listen to the common sentiment of Bernard's words. He says, "The church is brilliant in her walls, and the poor suffer lack. She sets gems in her stones and leaves her children naked." And you can see the disparity that he's saying. We build these wonderful grand cathedrals, and the church is glorious to look at, but yet we're neglecting the more important things. And a lot of the so-called heretics were saying the same thing. We need to reform the church. There needs to be renewal. Now, the point of departure historically for this gradual corruption of Christianity was held by many people to be linked to the donation of Constantine. And according to these visions of renewal and reform, many of which, of course, came to be regarded as heretical, when the Pope allegedly accepted the provisions of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, a voice was heard saying, "Today poison is poured into the church." From the time Christianity became legal, became recognized by the state, and then became the state religion, Christianity became corrupted. This was a widely held view among the so-called heretics. Now, the donation of Constantine is seen in frescoes in various churches. This one from the 13th century in a church in Rome. Constantine gives Pope Sylvester the tiara, symbolizing temporal power over the West. And you can see in this image where the emperor behind him is the saddled horse with which he will perform the bridal service for the Pope. This marriage between church and state, to use modern terms. Now, the other thing to mention is anti-clericalism. The term means exactly what it says, to be against the priests, the clerics. This climate of anti-clericalism formed a natural ambiance for heresy, because anti-clericalism was frequently the stimulus for heresy, as well as being its protection. In many trials and interrogations, the heretics repeatedly expressed the view that the entire church was damned. In their view, the entire church was damned. The priests, the monks, the nuns, the cardinals, the bishops, the popes, the whole lot damned because the truth of Christianity had been betrayed since the time of Constantine. This was not an isolated opinion. Now, to examine this idea of the corruption of the church and the need for reform, I want to turn in this lecture to a specific geographical location and look at a movement for religious renewal and reform, if you will, which evolved into a popular, indeed a powerful, popular movement. I want to speak of the Society of Languedoc, which is a region in what is today southern France. Now, southern France, and I want to say some things about background and context so that you have some understanding of the nature of this movement. Southern France could be and was distinguished from surrounding regions on a number of levels. One, its distinctive character, and secondly, linguistic distinctives, which continue to mark southern France to the present. In this area, people spoke in one of 5 dialects, all collectively described as the Languedoc, and here we get the actual name for the region. It's linked to the language, and the linguistic distinction, the dialects spoken in southern France are different from the French that's spoken in Paris and in areas of northern France. Now, lower Languedoc, where we're going to spend some time in this session, was not a homogeneous region. It was politically fragmented. Now, that's going to be important for understanding some of the developments to come. It's noteworthy when we speak of political fragmentation that the kings of England had more power in the region of Languedoc in the 12th century than the kings of France did. Now, I need to admit that I'm being anachronistic here because terms like France and England are really a bit inaccurate at this time, but they're convenient shorthands for describing the feudal arrangements of the 12th and 13th centuries. It would take some time for these areas to evolve into the states of England and the nation of France that we know today. But for convenience, let me simply use the terms England and France. Now, this led to a situation in southern France where the formation of strong consolidated lordships was discouraged, and formal feudal ties were much weaker here than elsewhere in Europe. Now, once again, this is important for understanding how and why certain things would develop religiously. There's no centralized form of government then. This is important to point out. And the distribution of power was essentially fourfold. First of all, there was regional, political, and feudal power. Second source of power was the Inquisition, which was actually based in the city of Carcassonne, and we'll be coming back to Carcassonne a number of times. The authority of the bishop, principally in Toulouse. And fourthly, the Kingdom of France, as it existed at that time. Now, this area was characterized and beset by continuous warfare, internal, internecine warfare, if you will. But notwithstanding the conflict, there was economic prosperity to be had. Now, inheritance customs were innovated. And again, you may wonder, how does this relate to the history of Christianity? Well, we cannot divorce religion from what's going on in the specific context. Things like inheritance laws and customs would be crucial in southern France in the 13th and 14th centuries. So in terms of inheritance, free bequest rather than the rights of primogeniture persisted. And so the eldest son did not just automatically inherit in southern France as they did elsewhere. The lower nobility especially divided their estates among several heirs. This would lead to political fragmentation. Sometimes those heirs were women, no less, which was a bit of a deviation from the normal medieval custom. And so we had multiple lordships socially, which helps to explain many of the loose or the non-existent feudal ties here between the overlords and the vassals. During the 12th century, right on the eve of where I want to take us in this particular session, many towns freed themselves from the authority of their conventional feudal lords and the bishops. Many cities, in fact, became self-governing, among them Toulouse, Saint-Gilles, Béziers, and Carcassonne. And a number of those places will be very essential for the study of Cathericism. Additionally, I should point out that France, and particularly southern France, was affected by the flowering of Western civilization that scholars like to call the 12th century Renaissance. This contributed in several ways. One, the vernacular poetry of the troubadours. Secondly, political satires arose at this time. And thirdly, epics like the Song of the Cather Wars, which actually is a very important text for understanding our subject tonight. The society in Languedoc was much more urbanized and cosmopolitan than it was in northern France. And the ideals that characterized this society resembled more the aristocracy than it did the church. And again, important clues in the background. Between about the year 1000 and 1350, there's extraordinary demographic expansion in Languedoc. There was also, important to note, the absence of strong secular or ecclesiastical authority, which we've noted, and this made the suppression or the control of heresy very difficult. There was also an absence of flourishing cathedral schools in Languedoc, and this helps to explain in part the weakness of the official church. The Catholic Church gradually grew weaker and weaker in Languedoc, while the Cathars grew correspondingly stronger, to the point where it was said around the year 1215, few men die in Languedoc without being hereticated, without becoming heretics. Now that's an extraordinary statement, and we'll want to investigate the veracity of that. But how bad were things in Languedoc? Let me give you just a couple of examples. Fulkrand, who was the Bishop of Toulouse, in the early 13th century was reported to have received no tithes whatsoever. Now that's probably an exaggeration, but imagine a bishop who doesn't get any tithes. That suggests that there's not a lot of support. Bishop Otto resigned his see, which was Carcassonne, in the year 1198 because he was so discouraged at the significant inroads that the heretics were making in this part of the country. There was, moreover, a common attitude of toleration towards heresy in Languedoc. Tolerance of or active support of the heresy seemed to be an acceptable feature of life of many families of the middling and lesser aristocracy in southern France at this time. Now the point I'm making is that this is not just a bunch of ruffians who are heretics, not just a bunch of people like Lutar and Tankelm that I talked about in a previous lecture, these peasants who were unlearned. I'm speaking of the aristocracy who were either heretics or tolerant of it. Heretics lived openly in villages and were known to everyone. Everyone knew who the Cathars were. This was no great secret. In fact, one peasant would later tell Jacques Fournier, who was an inquisitor in the 1320s, he made this statement that when heresy entered a house in Languedoc, it was like leprosy, and it remained there for generation after generation after generation. The secret of success for heresy in southern France was the family unit, which preserved and protected the teachings in question. when Count Raymond III was asked, "Why don't you do anything about getting rid of heresy?" here's what he said in reply: "We cannot. We have grown up among them. We have relatives among them, and we see them living good, decent lives." In other words, to try and get rid of the heresy would be to tear the social fabric, the familial relations apart. Therefore, I cannot and I will not do anything. Languedoc seems to have had a propensity for heresy, and once it was rooted, I can tell you from my number of years of studying heresy, it proved to be one of the most difficult areas in all of Europe to uproot it once it had sunk its roots down into the soil of that area, as it were. Very difficult to eradicate heresy from Languedoc. So much so that when the 16th century rolled around and the Protestant Reformation came into bloom, Languedoc welcomed the Protestants. So, all of that to say this: the authorities viewed Languedoc as a terrible place. And we can find this in the literature of the period, that Languedoc is a terrible place. And a power struggle would emerge between the church and between the secular authorities. And it produced, in the middle of that conflict, a vision of a different kind of church, a different approach to religion altogether. We have, fortunately, a 13th century inquisitor's report from the church archives in Carcassonne, which provides vital information on the tensions and the activities going on in the area during this period of the Middle Ages. The Albigensian Crusade of the early 13th century, which I will be returning to in a moment, was against the Cathars, and it adversely affected another group called the Waldensians, whom we'll consider in a separate lecture. The transfer of the papacy from Rome to Avignon in southern France was apparently the signal for a brutal repression of heretics. It put the popes in the backyard, as it were. And at length, these heretics, dwelling in Languedoc, and there were two kinds of them, Cathars and Waldensians, they were demonized. It's essential to demonize your enemies. You dehumanize them. You demonize them. And so they were made to be engaged in all sorts of nefarious activities. There were allegations that the Cathars, when they met, they would have some sort of service, and then they would all take turns kissing the backside of a cat. The Waldensians were thought to get a goat and kiss the goat's backside. You can see this sort of disgust that you could generate if you really thought your neighbors down the street were holding secret meetings in their cellars and engaging in some of this nonsense. The fact that it wasn't true is neither here nor there. All you've got to do is get people to believe that it's true. Now that's enough background. That's enough context, I think, for us to turn now to look specifically at this group of people whom history knows as the Cathars. The Count of Toulouse, Raymond V, and there's a lot of Raymonds in English, and it gets rather confusing in the Languedoc, so I'll try and use their numbered title to keep them separate. But Raymond V appealed for help with respect to the heresy in the year 1177. And he wrote, he said, "The disease of heresy has, notice the language, the disease of heresy has grown so strongly in my lands that almost all who are practicing it think they are serving God. They don't even think they're deviants." The heresy that the Count had in mind was Catharism. And there had been heresy in southern France from at least the 11th century. Now the term Cathar itself comes from the Greek. It seems like there's so much that goes back to the original Greek. It means the pure ones. The pure ones. But the so-called Cathars never actually used that term to describe themselves, like the reformers in Bohemia who were called Hussites, and the Waldensians and the Lutherans. These terms were meant to be derisive. They were not, and a sneer. The term Cathar seems to have originated with the German monk Ecbert von Schernau in the 12th century, who preached against Cathars in 1163 and presided over the burning of heretics. He seems to have invented this. The Cathars simply called themselves good Christians. That's how they described themselves. The Cathar heresy probably originated in the Balkans, Southeast Europe, and it spread into Europe in the course of the 12th century. Now, the Cathars of Languedoc also came to be known as the Albigensians, named after one of their principal cities, Albi. What did these medieval Cathars believe? I limit my analysis to the period between 1170 and 1250. Several things. So we understand what they believed, and that, I think, will help us understand why the church was so vehemently opposed to the continuation of this sect. They believed that the Bible was divinely inspired, but with some notable exceptions. According to a 12th century anti-heretical book, I quote, "The Cathars believe that there are two gods. One is a good and a Savior, the Father of good spirits, in which they believe. The other created the world and human beings, and they have no faith in this God. The Father of spirits was light. The Creator of the world was for them the Prince of darkness." So they believed in two gods. They were co-eternal, these two gods, but they're dualists. Two gods. They believed the evil God had created the world, the material universe, the flesh. The good God had created the heavens and the soul, which was eternal. They professed that the Son and the Holy Spirit were legitimate, but regarded them as inferior to God. And they were also docetic in their Christology. Jesus could not possibly have literally been born of a virgin woman. This had to be understood symbolically. Transubstantiation was absurd, absolutely absurd. Why, there would never be enough flesh and blood to go around if we keep transubstantiating these communion wafers and cups of wine into body and blood. I mean, come on. And to say nothing of the fact that it's material. You think that God is going to imprison God's self in corruptible flesh? Nonsense. Cathars didn't believe it. They had a ritual called in Latin the consolamentum. It's baptism in the Spirit by the laying on of hands, effectively. And through this rite, the soul of the believer was unified with his or her spirit, and this broke the cycle of reincarnation. The soul is purified then in this sacrament, which enables it to escape from the material world at death. Now, the consolamentum could only be performed by a perfect. Now, the perfects were particular Cathars. I would describe them, in a sense, to give it a Christian analogy, as the Cathar clergy, who traveled about in pairs. Their river ford can be seen to this day in the Languedoc. They lived lives of voluntary poverty. These perfects did. They abstained from sexual relations. They observed an austere diet. They mainly lived on bread and fish. And I would point out they were also female perfects. The consolamentum was generally reserved until the point of death, because once you were consoled, as they called it, the Cathar thereafter could only subsist upon water. Some were lucky to be consoled just before death came for them. For others, they had to embark upon a hunger strike to the bitter end. They held to an Episcopal church polity, abstinence from meat, from dairy products, though this was not taken seriously by the rank and file Cathar. They wouldn't take oaths. People and animals had the same value in the Cathar scheme of things. They did not recognize marriage. As such, though, plenty of them were married. There's a distinguishment between the perfects and your ordinary Cathars. Sexuality was part of the devil's creation, not part of the good God's creation. But sexual freedom did exist. And if I take you through the inquisitorial registers, we find clerical non-celibacy, concubinage, we even find incest among some of the Cathars. I'll give you one example. A perfect, no less, who was supposed to have sworn off all of these fleshly delights and desires, got his concubine pregnant. What to do now? He simply married her off, temporarily, to a shepherd for a few days so that the latter, the shepherd, might be thought to be the father of the said unborn child, and the perfect would therefore not be shamed. So, you know, there was some unethical behavior that went on in Catharism as much as anywhere else. And they were finally intolerant of the official church. There were preposterous accusations against the Cathars that they worshiped the devil, that they engaged in blasphemy, that they were sexual perverts, and so on. We've already learned that part of the way you deal with the other is to demonize them. Attach issues, attach accusations to them that are going to make them contemptible in the eyes of others. Their detractors claim that the Cathars were the most wretched of all heretics. They actually turned churches into brothels. I've mentioned there was wide support for these heretics among the nobility of Languedoc. And prior to the war, there were plenty of what we might consider Cathar religious houses. A number of villages in the Languedoc were regarded as being entirely devoted to the Cathar heresy. The medieval church was worried. And I think I've said enough about these people that if you were a priest or a pope in the later Middle Ages, you would be worried too. This is a handful of people. It's a whole area that seems to have converted from the official church to this form of religion. Even before the 13th century, which I want to focus in this particular lecture, the authorities had already taken steps to contain the heresy. In 1114, 2 peasants north of Paris were arrested on charges of suspicious behavior. Guibert of Nogent, an abbot in the area, claimed there were many such heretics just like these two who had been arrested. The two, before they ever got to trial, were lynched and burned alive by indignant Parisians. Around 1120, some Cathars were burned at Toulouse. Whenever possible, their books were confiscated and thrown into the fires. In 1159, in England no less, 30 German refugees were arrested and tried at Oxford. They were whipped, they were branded on their foreheads and thrown out of town. At Cologne in Germany, in 1163, 2 Cathars were lynched and burned alive. There were other violent murders in 1167 at Vézelay of those reputed to be in league with the devil. And visual images showed demons coming to the stake and collecting the souls of the charred heretics as they expired in the flames. And the souls would often be depicted as babies coming out of their mouths, and the demons would take them. At the Third Lateran Council, which was convened in Rome in the year 1179, Pope Alexander III denounced the Cathars, saying they're as thick as thieves and they are poisoning the minds of average people, and by God, we have got to do something. The church correctly, and I underscore the word correctly, perceived that Catharism was seditious. It undermined ecclesiastical authority absolutely. It claimed the official church was a hoax. And that being the case, why in the world should we pay tithes and taxes to a hoax? Well, if you stop withholding the tithes and taxes, this is really going to affect the performance of medieval religion. Church wealth proved to the Cathars that the church belonged to the world of matter, which we've already seen was negative and was bad, was effectively evil. This meant the medieval church was the whore of the apocalypse and a community of wolves. These are terms from the sources of the time. The voluminous collection of relics which the church had amassed, bits of bone and other material objects, the emphasis upon the Eucharist with its focus on flesh and blood, to say nothing of the cross, absolutely repugnant to the Cathars, and simply proved that Christendom, as it had evolved by the 13th century, was a corruption of the original vision of Jesus and the apostles. Now, all of this meant, I think it comes as no surprise to anyone, that the church was prepared to preach a crusade against the Cathars. Some people think that crusades were only preached against infidels in the Holy Land. Not so. In the 13th century, the church will spend 20 years fighting a crusade against the Cathars. Now, the motive for the suppression of the Cathars, I think, has to be put down to the religious agenda of Pope Innocent III. When he took his seat upon the throne of St. Peter in 1198, he regarded action against heresy in Languedoc as a priority. 3 months after his investiture as the Vicar of Christ, he signaled his intention to do something in Languedoc in a letter that he sent to one of the archbishops, saying that the invoking of the temporal sword against heresy had to take place. Innocent III regarded Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse, as failing to protect Orthodox religion, failed to support the church in her struggle against heresy. And instead, he said, you have fostered a disruption of the peace, and you have undermined the good government of Christian society. So the Pope goes straight for one of the most powerful men in all of Languedoc. Well, there were wider implications and intentions in Innocent's program. The rise and the threat of heresy was central to him. He was concerned about the use of mercenaries by Raymond VI, which created disorder and insecurity. There were tolls and taxes which were being levied, which the Pope felt were unfair. A general disregard for church authority and jurisdiction. A persistent disrespect for church property. Remember, I said earlier, all of this political fragmentation and feuding and different lordships being established. The church was disadvantaged. And beyond this, Raymond was employing Jews, for heaven's sake. What does he think he's doing? The crucifiers of Jesus. This has got to stop. Innocent made it perfectly clear that he wished to pursue expeditiously what he regarded as the business of peace and faith. He doesn't call it a crusade, the business of peace and faith. So, what are we going to do? The time for talking is over. The time for this correspondence back and forth is over. We have made entreaties and you've done nothing. So Innocent sends up a personal representative, a man by the name of Peter, to go up to Languedoc as his legate to look into problems. Peter went up in 1207 and promptly excommunicated the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, because Raymond refused to join a peace league, which was the initial step in Innocent's program to suppress the heresy. Now we've got another Raymond here, Raymond Roger. It's a hyphenated name. I'll say it in English. The Count of Faux, his wife, and his sister, all professing Catholics, were in effect, in reality, Cathar heretics. So here's one of the counts, his wife and his sister, powerful people, and rather than aiding the church in her fight against heretics, Raymond Roger was offering the dissenters protection. So, Innocent took up the quill, and in May of 1207 wrote a strongly worded letter to that count in the Languedoc. I read just a sentence. "So think, stupid man, think. Cannot God, who is Lord of death and of life, suddenly cut off your days? Then his wrath will deliver you to eternal torment." I mean, think of the language. "You stupid man. You think you're going to defy me? I am the vicar of Jesus Christ, I'll have you know." Well, they weren't too impressed with the language coming out of Rome, but then tensions would escalate dramatically when on the 8th day of January in the year 1208, the papal legate Peter was assassinated. Now earlier, he'd actually withdrawn from Languedoc temporarily in fear of his life. Now he was set upon on the open road and somebody ran a lance straight through him. Innocent III regarded the murder as an act of war. Now I have to say, nobody knows who killed him, nobody owed up, but everybody suspected that Raymond VI had something to do with it. A crusade was preached. And off we go. Another Raymond Roger, this is a different Raymond Roger, who was the Viscount of Albi, Carcassonne, and Béziers, resisted. This was a young man, a young nobleman. He resisted the crusade. Now militarily, the first wave was entirely successful, but the heresy in Languedoc continued almost unabated. Raymond VI at length submitted. On the 18th day of June, 1209, Raymond VI, the Count of Toulouse, one of the most influential and powerful of the French nobles, the protector of heretics, was finally reduced to submission in the face of Inquisition and crusade. He was forced to hand over to the church 7 strongholds, to give them to the Crusaders, and submit to a public humiliation outside the church at Saint-Gilles. Before the cathedral, we are told the Count appeared naked, and in the presence of 22 bishops, swore an oath of obedience to the church. The papal legate then placed a rope around Raymond's neck, and while holding the rope, whipped him, and then pulled him into the church. This unfortunate and shamed count, it was a very symbolic, a public humiliation of him being accepted back into the church, drugged by the scruff of the neck, if you will, and being thrashed the whole way in. 4 days later, the events at Béziers, the 22nd of July, 1209, was a shocking event of crusading fervor. The Crusaders marched on Béziers. They looted the town. They looted the churches. The inhabitants were massacred. I understated. They were massacred. Children, women, men were killed inside churches. The town was burnt down. I need to back up just a moment. When they got to the gates of the town and were about to overrun it, someone had the presence of mind to say, wait a minute, how do we know what a Cathar looks like? How do we distinguish Cathars from good Catholics? The reply that is credited to Arnold Amory, the monk leading the crusade, was this: kill them all. God will know his own. And they did. Before lunch, we are told that the entire town, the majority of the town of 20,000 people, were massacred. 2,000 of them were killed inside churches. This might reasonably, without exaggeration, be called the first act of European genocide. Next, Carcassonne. A prolonged siege, and the town finally fell because of a shortage of water. Then remember Raymond Roger, who I mentioned a few moments ago, that count who initially resisted the crusade? He turned up dead in a prison cell in Carcassonne, probably murdered. At Minerve, 140 Cathar perfects had their ears, their noses, and their lips cut off. then to the stake, where we are told they leapt voluntarily into the flames rather than recant their Cathar faith. Defenders at Bram were also mutilated. One was left with one eye so that he could lead his 100 companions who'd been deprived of both of their eyes, their noses, their ears, and their upper lips on a march of 25 miles away to Cabaret. In Cassay, in 1211, 60 perfects perished in the fires of the stake. I'm talking about an inferno which roared across Languedoc during the so-called Albigensian Crusade. In the same year of 1211, 400 perfects were burned alive at other stakes elsewhere in the Languedoc. 17 perfects were found in a forest near Castelnau, and they likewise were burned. The Crusades continued intermittently, as I mentioned, for 20 years. Simon de Montfort, who became the Crusade leader, was finally killed at Toulouse in 1218. But by 1222, Raymond VI had recovered all of his lands that had been lost. This was the shamed count who'd been whipped at Saint-Gilles. It was all over with by 1229, when Raymond VII made peace with the official church and the French crown. But he too, as part of his acceptance by the church, had to submit to a similar public scourging as his father had 20 years earlier. The persecution, of course, continued against those who chose not to conform. And you can still see the caves to this day in southern France where Cathars took refuge, where they hid to avoid the onslaught of crusade and persecution. Now, the main story of the Cathars belongs to the period between 1209, which is when the Albigensian Crusade began, and 1244. Because in 1244, the last refuge of the Cathars, a place called Montségur, was taken after an 8-month siege in the year 1244. Between 400 and 500 people, men, women, and children, were on Montségur. This is a fortress on the top of a very steep rock, as it were. They were there when it fell to the crusading armies. They were given a stark choice, these several hundred people: recant or die. 200 Cathar defenders from Montségur kept the faith and were burned alive in the flames of the stake. It was not so easy to eradicate heresy. Not so easy. You could kill people, you could preach crusades, but the heresy was extremely difficult to eradicate. Now, I said the main story goes up to 1244 when this particular fortress falls, but that's not the end of Catharism. So I want to jump forward a little bit in time and consider the resurgence and the revival of the Cathars in the 14th century. Catharism had been contained, certainly, but it had not been eradicated. In Languedoc, in villages like Montelieu, the Cathars were resurrected, and they flourished until the 1220s, though it must be said that that resurgence, that revival, existed on some rather unstable foundations. But the point is, it had existed from the time of the Albigensian Crusade. 100 years later, there are still pockets powerful enough to attract the Inquisition of Cather heresy. The work of the Inquisitors, Bernard Guy and Jacques Fournier, spelled the end of Catharism finally in Languedoc in their work in the 14th century. The Cistercian, Fournier, was an insatiably curious man. He was meticulous. He was suspicious. He was an excellent candidate for an inquisitor to root out heresy. The surviving dossier of his procedures in Montelieu is a revealing close-up view of ordinary people who just happened to be extraordinary heretics. Montelieu, at the time, was a village of some 200 to 500 people. Most of them were Cathar. The rest of them were probably Cathar sympathizers. In Fournier's register, we get these glimpses of peasant life, people eating, of eavesdropping on conversations. The picture of 4 people of different ages and gender all in bed together. An old man sunning himself, women gossiping at the mill, an old woman dying, being hereticated by perfects in long blue hooded cloaks. We see pictures in the dossier, in the register, of filthy houses, a Cathar priest and his mistress misbehaving behind the high altar under the cover of night. A world of heresy. It's a fascinating document. A world of heresy seen through the eyes of mostly illiterate peasants. An inquisitor obsessed with stamping out the rural roots of heresy either by argument or by fire. Now, I've given you these details from the dossier, and there's many more, of course, to give you a glimpse into the character of Jacques Fournier, who would later be Pope. Here was a man who was not going to allow any stone to go uncovered. No, he wanted to hear about the gossip among the women at the washer place. He wanted to know about the man sunning himself under the tree. He wanted all of the details. He wanted these people to come in, and he interrogated them. And he took down just about everything, it seems, that they said, which makes it an extraordinary, valuable document for the study of our topic and indeed of social history in the Middle Ages. When the Inquisitor Jacques Fournier was finished in Montelieu, the Cathars were little more than a memory in the history of the village. For Languedoc in general, Cathar heresy is now only silently present in the ruins of their fortresses and castles, which persist to this day, which are often the goal of hiking trails in southern France. Well, by way of summary, it may be said that the Albigensian Crusade, this military initiative fought over some 2 decades, had little success of achieving its primary goal. I'm of the opinion that war very seldom achieves its primary goal, particularly when it's by a hostile invading force. Now, you can cause a lot of damage and kill a lot of people, but it's pretty difficult to break the back of resolve of people who hate you, because they can just keep on hating you, and the more of them you kill, the more they will hate you, and hate is one of the most powerful motivations for we Homo sapiens. It had little success of achieving the suppression of heresy in Languedoc. Many were burned. I told you a few stories. Many more were killed, but the heresy persists and continued. Catharism was not eradicated. It persisted. And a century after the Crusade, it fell to Bernard Guy, the Inquisitor of Toulouse, from 1307 to 1323, to resume the business of eradicating this stubborn, persistent heresy. He made a great effort to exterminate the heretics. He issued a total of 930 sentences during his tenure as Inquisitor, along with 69 orders for exhumation of heretics dead and buried who needed to be dug up and gotten rid of. His efforts were mainly successful, and they have to be coupled to the efforts of the aforementioned Jacques Fournier. The last Cathar perfect was betrayed into the hands of the Inquisition and burned alive at Villarouge in the spring of 1321. The heresy lingers, appearing in Albi, in Béziers, and elsewhere in the 14th century, and indeed Bosnia appears to be the promised land of heresy, the ultimate outpost of the Cathars, and that's where we find the remnant at the end of the Middle Ages. Well, eventually the heresy did finally disappear. But I have to agree with some of the scholars of the Cathar movement that its extinction is somewhat of an enigma. But it's worth noting that changes in Cathar doctrine and in Cathar practice brought the heresy, now by the 14th century, back closer to its Catholic counterpart, thus blurring the distinctives between Cathars and Catholics. I mention once more the importance of familial solidarity. The family unit was very important, very significant. The only way, really, ultimately, to stamp out Cathar heresy, which tended, as I've mentioned previously, to exist as a family ingredient passed down from one generation to another, was to destroy the familial and social solidarity, and that's precisely what the Inquisition did. The Inquisition adopted the posture of destroying families and of ripping apart the social fabric. And I have to tell you, at the end of it all, that tactic was altogether successful. 10 years after his Inquisition, Jacques was made Pope. He took the name Benedict XII. 8 years later, on the 25th of April, 1342, he was dead of gangrene. 100 years ago, the vast Fournier Register dealing with the final suppression of the Cathar heresy came to light after more than 500 years of near oblivion in the great vaults of the Vatican in Rome. As one turns the pages of that inquisitorial register, the heresy of the Cathars appears once more like a dead star, giving off a cold and fascinating light, defeated, yet strangely alive.